67% of American workers reported feeling burned out at some point in 2023, according to a Gallup survey of over 15,000 full and part-time employees. That number was 42% in 2016. The American Institute of Stress estimates that job stress costs the U.S. economy $300 billion annually in absenteeism, diminished productivity, employee turnover, and healthcare costs. A 2021 survey by Indeed, encompassing 1,500 workers across industries, found that 52% of all respondents, including 67% of millennials, were experiencing burnout, up sharply from pre-pandemic figures. The World Health Organization formally classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon in its International Classification of Diseases in 2019, ICD-11, citing three defining features: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. The WHO did not classify it as a medical condition. The distinction matters more than it appears. Microsoft's 2023 Work Trend Index, drawn from a survey of 31,000 people across 31 countries, found that 39% of workers globally described themselves as exhausted. A 2022 study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that physicians experiencing burnout were twice as likely to be involved in a medical error as those who were not. 44% of American teachers reported feeling burned out often or always in a 2022 Gallup poll, a number that, in 1985, when the same question was asked of the same profession, was 26%. 81% of Gen Z workers reported in Deloitte's 2023 Global Millennial and Gen Z survey that they have felt overwhelmed by the pace of their work. The average American worker received 126 emails per day in 2022, per the Radicati Group. In 2010, that number was 80. None of this is insomnia. None of it is fixed by sleep. The data arrived long before the language did. The phenomenon has a clinical name now. Burnout, named by the psychologist Herbert Freudenberger in a 1974 paper published in the Journal of Social Issues, in which he observed the progressive depletion of volunteers at a free clinic in New York City, is not depression, though it can precede it. It is not laziness, though it has historically been described in those terms by the people it most severely affects. It is not a personality flaw, a generational weakness, or the predictable consequence of people who chose careers they weren't suited for. It is a structural mismatch between the demands placed on a human nervous system and the resources that system has available to meet those demands. That is not a therapeutic reframing. It is what the evidence shows. The distinction matters because the framing determines the remedy. If burnout is a personal failure, the remedy is personal. Work harder, complain less, sleep better, take a vacation. If burnout is structural, the remedy is structural. Redesign the system, redistribute the load, remove the conditions that create the mismatch. Almost every institution in American life has chosen the first explanation. Almost every data point measuring the consequences of that choice shows that it has not worked. Christina Maslach, professor emerita of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the person most responsible for the scientific framework that currently defines burnout, has spent 4 decades making this argument in peer-reviewed literature and watching it be ignored in practice. Her 1981 instrument, the Maslach Burnout Inventory, still the most widely used measure of burnout in clinical and organizational research, identifies 3 dimensions: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, a psychological distancing from one's work and the people involved in it, and reduced sense of personal accomplishment. These 3 dimensions interact. None of them requires a sleep deficit to be present. All of them can coexist with someone sleeping 8 hours a night and still waking up tired in a way they cannot name. The exhaustion that defines burnout is not biological. It is cognitive, emotional, and motivational. It is the exhaustion of caring about something in an environment that systematically punishes caring. It is the exhaustion of decision-making without authority, of accountability without agency, of being asked to perform competence within systems designed to produce failure. Burnout is not a new experience. It is a new name for something that has appeared in different forms and under different labels at every moment in history when the pace and nature of human work changed faster than the social structures meant to support it. The Industrial Revolution generated a phenomenon that contemporary observers described as neurasthenia, a term coined by the American neurologist George Miller Beard in 1869 to describe a constellation of symptoms including fatigue, anxiety, headache, and impotence that he attributed to the overextension of the nervous system under the demands of modern life. Beard saw neurasthenia as a disease of civilization, specifically of American civilization, which he considered uniquely productive and uniquely punishing. The condition was treated with rest cures, electrical stimulation, and, in the case of women, enforced confinement. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who suffered a breakdown after childbirth in 1887 and was prescribed a rest cure by neurologist S. Weir Mitchell, wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a direct account of how the treatment made her worse. What Mitchell called neurasthenia, what Gilman called confinement, and what the data now measures as burnout are not identical phenomena. But they share a structure. A person whose internal resources have been exhausted by external demands, trapped in a system that explains their collapse as personal rather than systemic. The post-World War II American economy produced its own version of the phenomenon, which was described not as a disease, but as a character type. The 1956 bestseller, The Organization Man by William H. White, documented what White saw as the psychological cost of corporate conformity, the slow erosion of individual will in workers who had oriented their entire identity around institutional belonging. The burnout was there, the language wasn't. White saw workers who had given everything to institutions that could not, by design, reciprocate. He did not call it burnout. He called it the organization man's bargain, and he thought it was a bad one. The 1970s, the decade in which Freudenberger named the phenomenon, were also the decade in which the American economy underwent the structural transformations that would eventually produce the burnout rates of the 2020s. Stagflation decoupled productivity from wages. The decline of organized labor removed institutional buffers between workers and employer demands. The shift from manufacturing to services began the long reorientation of the American economy toward work that was explicitly emotional, work that required not just time and physical output, but mood, affect, and the sustained performance of well-being. The sociologist Arlie Hochschild at the University of California, Berkeley, called this emotional labor in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, studying flight attendants who were required not just to perform their jobs, but to feel the right feelings while doing them. Hochschild identified the cost. The sustained management of one's own emotional state in service of an employer's commercial interest produces a particular kind of depletion that has nothing to do with how many hours were worked or how well one slept. 40 years later, emotional labor is not a feature of some jobs. It is a requirement of most of them. If this is landing somewhere real for you, share it with someone who needs the language for what they've been feeling. The data is the only thing that makes this arguable. The research on what actually produces burnout has converged on 6 workplace conditions, identified by Masslech and her colleague Michael Later in their 2008 framework published by the American Psychological Association. The conditions are workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. Burnout in the Masslech-Later model is not produced by any single one of these mismatches. It is produced by the accumulation of several of them operating simultaneously. An overloaded worker who has significant control over their work feels fairly compensated and works within a coherent value system can sustain that overload. A worker with manageable hours who has no control receives inadequate reward and works within a value system that conflicts with their own will burn out even if the calendar looks light. This is the complication that makes burnout resistant to individual solutions. No amount of meditation resolves a control deficit. No number of wellness apps addresses a fairness mismatch. And no vacation, not 1 week. Not 2, meaningfully repairs the depletion produced by years of operating within systems where the 6 conditions are chronically out of alignment. The neurological dimension of this has been documented. A 2017 study led by Armida Galkar at the Karolinska Institutet in Sweden used fMRI imaging to compare brain activity in workers diagnosed with burnout against healthy controls. Workers with burnout showed reduced capacity to regulate emotional responses in the prefrontal cortex and heightened amygdala reactivity, the same neural signature associated with chronic stress. The prefrontal cortex, the region most responsible for executive function, planning, and the regulation of emotional response, was measurably impaired. The workers were not imagining their cognitive difficulties. The organ responsible for managing complexity was functioning differently than it had before the burnout set in. The 2021 paper, Neural Correlates of Burnout, an activation likelihood estimation meta-analysis, published in Neuroimage. Clinical, led by Christopher Sigard Larsen at Aarhus University in Denmark, aggregated neuroimaging data from 11 prior studies of burnout and found consistent patterns of altered activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and bilateral angular gyrus, regions associated with self-referential thought, mind-wandering, and the integration of cognitive and emotional processing. The researchers noted that these patterns overlapped significantly with those observed in major depressive disorder, while also differing in ways that supported the classification of burnout as a distinct phenomenon. The brain of a person experiencing burnout is a brain that has reorganized its activity to accommodate chronic demand while progressively losing the capacity to do so effectively. It is a system compensating for a condition it was not designed to sustain indefinitely. Sleep does not repair this. 8 hours of rest does not rebuild a depleted prefrontal cortex if the conditions that depleted it are still present every morning. The smartphone arrived in 2007. The always-on work culture it enabled had been building since at least the early 1990s, when the spread of email first made it possible for employers to contact workers outside of working hours. But the smartphone collapsed the last structural barrier between work time and recovery time. It made the boundary not just permeable, but invisible. The data on this is not subtle. A 2022 report by the American Psychological Association found that 44% of employed adults in the United States check work email after hours, including during vacation. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology by researchers at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign found that the expectation of availability outside of work hours, even when workers did not actually respond, produced measurable increases in exhaustion and decreased recovery. The expectation alone was enough. The cognitive load of monitoring for potential demands consumed recovery resources even in the absence of actual work. The workers were not working, they were waiting, and waiting, it turns out, is its own form of labor. The pandemic compressed all of this into a single global experiment with no control group. Between March 2020 and the end of 2021, the office, the physical structure that had at least provided a spatial boundary between work and not work, disappeared for approximately 42% of the American workforce, according to Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom's research tracking remote work adoption. What replaced it was not a better system. It was no system. Workers did not gain 2 hours of commute time back as rest. They spent it working. The data from NordVPN teams, which tracked login and logout times for over 10 million remote workers across Europe and the United States, found that the average workday lengthened by 2 to 3 hours during the first year of the pandemic. The work expanded to fill the space where life had been. The pandemic also removed the informal social infrastructure of the workplace. The conversations at the coffee machine, the visual confirmation that colleagues also looked tired, the ambient sense of shared experience, and replaced it with Zoom calls that research consistently shows are more cognitively taxing than in-person meetings. A 2021 study by Jeremy Bailenson at the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab, published in Technology, Mind, and Behavior, identified 4 specific mechanisms by which video conferencing produces fatigue: excessive close-up eye contact, reduced mobility, the cognitive load of seeing one's own face, and the loss of nonverbal signals that the brain uses to process social information efficiently. The meetings did not get shorter. They got harder. And beneath all of this, a structural transformation that predates the pandemic and will outlast it: the progressive elimination of middle management. Between 2010 and 2020, according to research by McKinsey Global Institute, the number of management layers in large American companies decreased by an average of 25%. This was framed as an efficiency gain. What it also was: a redistribution of coordination, communication, and decision-making load onto workers who had not been trained for those functions and were not compensated for performing them. The work did not disappear. It was redistributed downward, without title change, without pay adjustment, and without acknowledgement that the load had shifted. The burnout literature has documented consistent disparities in who experiences the phenomenon most severely. The data does not support a narrative of universal suffering. It supports a narrative of unequal suffering, distributed in patterns that follow existing lines of social and economic disadvantage. Women report higher rates of burnout than men across most industries surveyed. A 2021 McKinsey report on women in the workplace, drawing on survey data from over 65,000 people, found that women were more than twice as likely as men at the same level to report feeling burned out often or almost always. The report identified a specific driver: the double shift, the performance of paid work, and the invisible, uncompensated labor of household management and caregiving that falls disproportionately on women. During the pandemic, this double shift became visible in the data in one of the most economically significant ways possible. Between February and April 2020, 2.3 million women left the American workforce, compared to 1.8 million men, according to the National Women's Law Center. Many did not return. Those who stayed and continued working, research consistently shows, did so while carrying a cognitive and emotional load that their male counterparts did not carry at equivalent rates. Healthcare workers present a different case study in the same structural argument. Before the pandemic, burnout rates among physicians in the United States were already elevated. A 2019 survey published in Mayo Clinic Proceedings, led by Tate Shanifolt at Stanford Medicine and drawing on data from over 15,000 physicians, found that 44% met criteria for burnout, a number that had been rising steadily since at least 2011. The pandemic did not create physician burnout. It revealed how close to the edge the system had already been operating. By 2022, Shanifolt's follow-up data showed burnout rates among physicians at 63%, a 19-point increase in 3 years. The system had been running at 44% burnout before it encountered additional catastrophic demand. The appropriate question is not why burnout increased during the pandemic. The appropriate question is why the pre-pandemic baseline was considered acceptable. Among Black workers, the picture is complicated by a phenomenon that researchers have named the Black tax. The additional cognitive and emotional labor required to navigate workplaces where race is a persistent source of hypervigilance, code switching, and the management of others' assumptions. A 2020 report by the Society for Human Resource Management found that Black workers were significantly more likely than their white counterparts to experience isolation, exclusion, and the expectation of representing their entire racial group in professional settings. These experiences do not appear in most burnout measures, because most burnout measures were not designed with these experiences in mind. The mismatch burnout inventory, for all its rigor, was developed primarily from data on white workers in human services. Its blind spots are not neutral. The gig economy deserves a separate accounting. As of 2023, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated that approximately 16% of the American workforce earned income through gig or platform work. Though independent researchers using broader definitions of contingent labor place the number closer to 36%. Gig workers experience the burnout conditions mismatch identified in concentrated form: limited control, inconsistent reward, minimal community, and the complete absence of institutional fairness mechanisms. They also lack the legal protections, minimum wage guarantees, overtime requirements, workers' compensation, that exist in theory for traditional employees and in practice produce the modest buffers that slow burnout's acceleration. What the gig economy offers instead is the rhetoric of autonomy. The data on what that autonomy actually produces is not ambiguous. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next several videos in this series go places this one doesn't have space to reach. The global wellness industry was valued at $4.5 trillion in 2023, according to the Global Wellness Institute. The American corporate wellness market alone, the segment dedicated to employee health programs, mindfulness apps, stress reduction workshops, and resilience training, was worth approximately $51 billion in 2023, per Statista. These numbers have grown every year for the past 2 decades. Burnout rates have grown alongside them. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable outcome of applying individual-level solutions to structural-level problems. The corporate mindfulness movement, which entered the mainstream through John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in 1979, and became a management tool in the late 2000s, offers the clearest illustration of the mechanism. Mindfulness practice, as Kabat-Zinn developed it, is a clinically validated approach to reducing the subjective experience of suffering by changing one's relationship to one's thoughts and sensations. It works in the sense that the clinical literature supports its efficacy for anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. The question it was never designed to answer is, should someone meditate their way through a system that is genuinely producing unjust outcomes? The appropriation of mindfulness by corporate wellness programs, studied directly by management researchers Ronald Purser at San Francisco State University, whose 2019 book McMindfulness documented the transformation, removed the ethical and social dimensions of the practice, and retained only the stress reduction function. Mindfulness, in its corporate form, does not ask whether the source of stress is legitimate or whether the organization producing the stress bears any responsibility for its reduction. It asks the worker to change their internal experience of conditions that remain unchanged. This is not a neutral repackaging. It is a specific ideological choice made by institutions that locates the problem, and therefore the solution, inside the worker's mind. The data on corporate wellness program effectiveness does not provide much cover for this choice. A 2019 randomized controlled trial conducted by researchers at the University of Chicago and published in Management Science, examining 33,000 employees at a major U.S. retail chain, found that workplace wellness programs produced no statistically significant improvement in absenteeism, job performance, or healthcare costs over an 18-month period. A 2020 meta-analysis published in BMJ, covering 46 randomized controlled trials of workplace well-being interventions across 16 countries, found that the average effect size was small, and that the interventions with the largest effects were those targeting the organizational environment rather than individual behavior. The programs that worked were the ones that changed the work. The programs that dominated the market were the ones that changed the worker. There is one sector of the wellness industry that is worth separating from this critique. Clinical treatment for burnout psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, adapted for occupational stress, and in some cases, pharmacological support for the anxiety and depressive symptoms that co-occur with severe burnout, does carry meaningful evidence of efficacy. A 2021 systematic review in Frontiers in Psychology, led by Renzo Bianchi at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, found that psychotherapeutic interventions for burnout produced significant reductions in all 3 Mismatch dimensions. The review also noted that the existing literature suffered from heterogeneity, small sample sizes, and follow-up periods too short to assess durability. The evidence base exists. It is thinner than the marketing budgets of the companies selling the alternatives. Here is what the numbers describe, assembled plainly. A workforce experiencing a condition that costs $300 billion per year in measurable productivity losses, whose primary neurological mechanism has been documented in peer-reviewed imaging studies, whose causes have been rigorously specified in a framework that has existed since 1981, and whose solutions, the ones that demonstrably work, require changes to organizations rather than to individuals. And here is what most organizations have chosen to spend their money on instead: apps. 43 years after Maslach published the inventory, 50 years after Freudenberger named the phenomenon, the science was never the problem. That is all the script will say about that. The COVID-19 pandemic did not create the burnout crisis. It exposed the degree to which the preconditions for that crisis had been systematically built into the structure of modern working life. What it added was the removal of the compensating factors: social connection, physical separation of work and home, the ambient comfort of shared experience, that had allowed workers to sustain conditions that, in isolation and without those buffers, became unsustainable. The data from this period is beginning to produce longitudinal findings with sufficient follow-up time to be analytically useful. A study published in The Lancet in 2023, tracking a cohort of 2,400 healthcare workers across the United Kingdom through the first 3 years of the pandemic, found that burnout scores measured in 2020 were significantly predictive of mental health outcomes in 2023. Workers who met burnout criteria in the first year of the pandemic were 3 times more likely to report persistent psychological distress 3 years later, even after adjusting for pre-existing mental health conditions. The pandemic burnout was not temporary. It left a residue. The labor market disruption that followed, the period described in 2021 as the Great Resignation, during which the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics recorded the highest monthly quit rates since the agency began tracking the metric in 2000, is most coherently understood not as workers prioritizing leisure over labor, as it was frequently characterized in popular coverage, but as workers declining to re-enter conditions they had spent 18 months identifying as incompatible with basic functioning. The Pew Research Center's 2022 survey of Americans who had quit jobs in 2021 found that the most commonly cited reasons were low pay, lack of opportunity for advancement, and feeling disrespected at work. Not, notably, a preference for not working. The workers had done a calculation. The calculation had not favored the employer. The employers, for the most part, received this information and responded by increasing wages modestly, offering remote work arrangements, and then, by 2023, beginning a systematic reversal of remote work policies and announcing layoffs that concentrated job loss in the sectors, technology, media, professional services, where workers had most visibly exercised labor market leverage in 2021. The implicit message was legible. The conditions that produced the Great Resignation had not been resolved. The labor market conditions that made quitting viable had changed. The burnout data for 2023 and 2024 reflects this. Gallup's 2024 State of the Global Workplace report found that global employee engagement, a metric correlated inversely with burnout, had declined for the first time since 2015. In the United States, the percentage of actively disengaged workers increased. The quiet quitting phenomenon, the described practice of performing only the minimum required by a job without visible disengagement, was measured more precisely by Gallup in 2023 as encompassing 59% of the global workforce. The researchers described these workers as not engaged, present, compliant, and emptied. The evidence on recovery from clinical burnout is less developed than the evidence on burnout itself, partly because recovery is harder to study. It requires longitudinal follow-up, standardized measurement at multiple time points, and the absence of the conditions that produce the burnout in the first place, which is difficult to ensure in a working population. What exists is sufficient to complicate the dominant narrative. Recovery from burnout, in the research literature, is not equivalent to the absence of symptoms. It is the restoration of the capacity for engagement. And the research consistently finds that this restoration requires not just removal of the stressor, but an active rebuilding of what the stressor depleted. The sense of efficacy, the experience of reward, the perception of fairness, the quality of social connection at work. Wilmer Schauffele, professor of occupational health psychology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and one of the most cited researchers in the burnout literature, has developed the concept of work engagement as the positive antipode of burnout, a state characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption that occupies the opposite end of the same continuum. His research, published across multiple studies in the Journal of Applied Psychology and the European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, has consistently found that the conditions required to produce engagement are not simply the inverse of the conditions that produce burnout. Eliminating unfairness does not automatically produce fairness that is felt. Reducing workload does not automatically restore the sense of efficacy that chronic overload eroded. The damage and its repair do not operate symmetrically. This finding matters for policy. It means that reducing the sources of burnout, while necessary, is not sufficient to produce a recovered workforce. It also means that the timescale of recovery is longer than organizational decision-makers typically expect. Research by Schauffele and his colleagues suggests that full recovery from clinical burnout, defined as return to pre-burnout functioning across all three mismatch dimensions, typically requires between 1 and 3 years even with appropriate treatment and environmental change. Organizations that expect burnout to resolve when the stressor is removed are expecting the wrong thing. Workers who expect that a 2-week vacation will repair what years of mismatch have depleted are expecting the wrong thing. The vacation literature is specific on this point. A 2010 study by Jessica de Bloem at Radboud University in the Netherlands, published in the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology, tracked workers before, during, and after vacations, and found that the recovery effects of vacation, reduced stress, improved mood, increased energy, peaked during the vacation itself, and had almost completely faded within 1 week of returning to work. The vacation worked while it lasted. The system that depleted the worker was waiting. If you've made it this far, the comment section is worth reading this time. People are describing specific versions of this in granular detail that the research can't always capture. The framing of burnout as a generational problem, specifically as a millennial or Gen Z failing, an inability to tolerate the ordinary demands of working life, has been one of the most persistent and analytically unsupported explanations in popular discourse. It is worth engaging directly because the data that is cited in support of it is real. The interpretation is wrong. It is true that millennials and Gen Z report higher rates of burnout than older cohorts in most surveys. The Deloitte 2023 Global Survey found that 46% of millennials and 46% of Gen Z respondents reported feeling burned out, compared to lower rates among Gen X and Boomer respondents. This is typically interpreted as evidence that younger workers are less resilient, more entitled, or insufficiently habituated to workplace discomfort. The alternative interpretation, which the structural data supports. Millennials and Gen Z entered the workforce under conditions specifically likely to produce burnout, have experienced fewer of the structural protections that buffered their predecessors from those conditions, and have done so at a historical moment when the cognitive demands of work, information processing volume, emotional labor requirements, always-on availability expectations, are at their highest recorded levels. Millennials entered the workforce, as a cohort, during either the dot-com bust of 2000-2001 or the financial crisis of 2008-2009. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's research on the long-term wage effects of graduating into a recession, updated in 2021, found that workers who enter the labor market during recessions experience wage penalties that persist for up to 15 years. The millennial cohort has spent its entire working life navigating an economy that, by the standard measure of their parents' experience, did not function as expected. They paid higher tuition for college degrees that produced smaller wage premiums. They entered a housing market that priced them out of the asset accumulation that built the middle class in the post-war era. They accepted gig work, contract work, and unpaid internships as the price of labor market entry, acculturating themselves to conditions of precarity that previous generations encountered, if at all, as temporary. And then, When they reported feeling depleted by the cumulative weight of this, the discourse called it a generational weakness. Gen Z enters a labor market in which AI-driven displacement is a documented near-term reality, in which climate change represents a chronic background stressor that the research has begun connecting to anxiety and psychological exhaustion, and in which the social media environments that shaped their development have been documented in the research of Jean Twenge at San Diego State University and the large-scale analyses of Jonathan Haidt at New York University. To have specific deleterious effects on mental health, particularly for adolescent girls, whose depression and anxiety rates began rising in 2012, precisely when smartphone adoption crossed 50% penetration among American teenagers. The data does not describe a generation that cannot handle work. It describes a generation that entered systems designed to produce exhaustion and reported, accurately, that the systems were doing their job. The evidence on organizational interventions for burnout is smaller in volume than the evidence on individual interventions, partly because organizations are harder to randomize into controlled trials, and partly because there is less commercial incentive to fund research that might conclude that the organization needs to change. What exists is instructive. Microsoft's 2022 research on meeting culture, published internally and summarized in their Work Trend Index, found that adding just one meeting-free day per week to workers' schedules produced measurable reductions in self-reported stress and increases in productivity scores. The intervention required no budget, no app, and no training. It required a decision. 4-day workweek trial conducted in Iceland from 2015 to 2019, involving approximately 2,500 workers across multiple industries, and analyzed by researchers at ALDA and Autonomy, found that productivity was maintained or improved across most workplaces, while worker well-being metrics improved significantly. The trial was not a controlled experiment. It lacked randomization and appropriate control groups, and should be interpreted with that caveat. It is, however, the largest trial of its kind, and its findings have been largely consistent with smaller trials conducted in New Zealand, Perpetual Guardian, 2018, Japan, Microsoft Japan, 2019, and the United Kingdom, 61 companies, 2022, coordinated by 4-day Week Global. The UK trial, the most rigorously designed, found that 56 of 61 participating companies retained the 4-day week after the trial period, and that burnout scores among workers declined significantly relative to baseline. The academic literature on job crafting, the practice of allowing workers to modify the scope, relationships, and cognitive demands of their work within institutional constraints, provides a more granular picture of what autonomy enhancement looks like in practice. Research by Amy Wrzesniewski at Yale School of Management and Jane Dutton at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, developed across multiple studies, published in the Academy of Management Review and the Administrative Science Quarterly, has documented that workers who are given latitude to shape their work toward activities they find meaningful show significantly lower burnout rates, higher engagement, and greater job satisfaction. Even when the objective demands of the work are unchanged, the variable is not the workload. It is the degree to which the worker experiences agency within it. This is the complication in the structural argument. Not every solution requires organizational redesign at scale. Some meaningful improvement is achievable within existing structures through managerial behavior, cultural norms, and the deliberate expansion of worker latitude in day-to-day decisions. The problem is that these interventions are not scalable without cultural change at the organizational level, and cultural change at the organizational level is not achievable without leadership commitment that the burnout data suggests most organizational leaders have not yet made. The median tenure of an American CEO in 2023 was 4.9 years, according to research by Korn Ferry. The timeline for organizational culture change, in the management literature, is typically cited as 5 to 10 years. The incentive structure for short tenure leaders to make investments whose returns accrue beyond their expected tenure is, to apply the technical term, weak. Burnout is a long-term problem. the institutions that could address it are structured to optimize for the short term. The long-term trajectory of the conditions that produce burnout is not improving. The pace of information flow will not decrease. The boundary between work and not work, once dissolved by technology, will not be restored by the same technology without deliberate structural intervention. The emotional labor requirements of service-dominated economies will not diminish as those economies expand. The precarity of gig work will not self-correct in the absence of regulatory frameworks that currently exist only in fragments, in only some jurisdictions. The World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs Report 2023 projects that 83 million jobs will be displaced by automation and AI by 2027, while 69 million new jobs will be created, a net loss of 14 million positions. The new jobs created will, the report projects, disproportionately reward skills in analytical thinking, creative thinking, and what the report labels resilience, flexibility, and agility. These are, notably, the cognitive and emotional capacities most directly depleted by burnout. The economy of the near future will most reward the capacities that the conditions of the present are most systematically eroding. There is one demographic data point that deserves more weight than it typically receives in this discussion. Among workers aged 18 to 34, the cohort most likely to enter the workforce in the next decade's labor market, rates of what the American Psychological Association tracks as serious psychological distress have been rising since 2008, and as of the 2023 data, have not plateaued. In 2008, 7.7% of adults aged 18-25 reported serious psychological distress in the prior 30 days. In 2022, that number was 12.8%. This is not a burnout statistic specifically. It is a population health statistic describing the baseline mental health of the workforce that will sustain the next 30 years of economic productivity. The baseline is declining. The demands placed on that baseline are increasing. These two trajectories do not resolve. The counterargument, that workers are more willing to report psychological distress now than they were in 2008, producing apparent increases that are partly artifactual, is worth taking seriously. There is evidence that stigma reduction has increased reporting rates. The research on this, however, suggests that reporting rate changes account for some but not all of the observed increase. The phenomenon is real. Its magnitude is contested. The direction is not. The burnout literature has focused, appropriately, on individual experience, organizational behavior, and policy intervention. It has been less focused on a question that the data is beginning to make urgent. What happens to social and civic institutions when the population that staffs them is chronically depleted? Teachers are the most studied example. The 44% burnout rate documented by Gallup in 2022 sits within a context of documented teacher shortages that the Learning Policy Institute at Stanford, in a 2022 report tracking teacher supply and demand across the United States, projected would worsen through at least 2030 in mathematics, science, and special education. Burned-out teachers leave the profession. The profession has fewer teachers. The classes that remain are larger. The workload per remaining teacher increases. The burnout rate increases. The structural conditions for the next round of shortages are actively being produced by the consequences of the previous round. Healthcare follows the same logic with higher stakes. The Association of American Medical Colleges projected in its 2023 report that the United States would face a shortage of between 37,800 and 124,000 physicians by 2034. The range reflects uncertainty in modeling assumptions. The direction of the projection is consistent across all scenarios. Physician burnout is both a cause and an accelerant of this shortage. Burned-out physicians retire early, reduce hours, or leave clinical practice for administrative roles. The physicians who remain carry higher patient loads. The burnout rate increases. The projection worsens. There is a category of essential work, teaching children, caring for the sick and elderly, maintaining the legal and civic infrastructure of a democratic society, that cannot be automated away and cannot be allowed to fail without consequences for everyone. The workers performing this work are burning out at documented rates. The systems that depend on their sustained functioning are beginning to show the results. This is not a prediction. It is a description of what is already in the data.